Is
Yeah, recording.
well, now it says it. Yeah,
Now
this is Simon here. Yeah, no, okay. Yep. Okay, dismiss. Yep. Okay. Oh.
I'll be back 1 sec.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have. Oh. So I'm getting those two, the admit things coming up fine, but I'll let you do all the clicking.
We'll just give it a few more minutes.
Yeah, no reason to start. Let me see. Okay. There he is.
Simon, should we make a start and people can join if they're going to attend later? Because we're going to have an introduction. Oh, someone else?
If you keep clicking on if you click letting people in, Mark.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us for the first inaugural professorial lecture in quite some time. Robert, you might remember the kind of history of this, but I don't think we've done them for a very long time.
It's been a while.
Yeah, and so it's a tradition that I think we'd like to bring back into the department as a kind of celebration of both the individual success of colleagues, but also in terms of highlighting the research that's going on in the department. And I think earlier in the year when we talked about this in the research committee, this was the plan for this year, but then we kind of started to think that maybe this year in particular with the lockdown wasn't the year to kind of bring it back. But I think given the kind of difficulties of this term, we thought it'd be a nice idea to celebrate the success of our colleagues. And so, I'm very pleased to kind of welcome you all to this event. We're going to begin with Professor Robert Gaia introducing the lecture that Simon is going to give and, introducing Simon as a colleague. And we're going to have Simon talking about his recent book that he's, I think it's published now, isn't it, Simon?
It is, yes.
And Simon's going to talk for around 40 minutes. And then we've got time for maybe 20, 30 minutes of questions. So I'll hand over to Robert. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. What I wanted to do, it's first and foremost, this is a pleasure and an honor for me to be able to introduce Simon's inaugural professorial lecture. I'm very, very happy to do this, and I'm very, very happy that I was asked to do this. I wanted to go back just a bit in time and to sort of go back because I was on the committee that hired Simon back in summer of 2012. And at the time, I was going to make a few historical linkages in this. The London Olympics were going on. Boris Johnson had just been re-elected mayor of London, coalition government in the UK. Obama was just re-elected, and this was the birth of the famous internet grumpy cat. So lots of things were going on. PPR itself was going through challenging times. We just had a departmental merger, and we were down to 28 academic staff, so much smaller than we are today. And Simon was one of the first wave of very young academics coming into the department. According to an old email, I managed to trawl through my ancient emails to find one from Tony McHenry about the application. And he noted at the time that Simon had been a guest lecturer at Leeds. I'm not quite sure if that's the way to put it, before coming in 2009. And at the time he was hired, he had 2 articles and his first book was due out. Okay, so this is way back, start of his career, young man coming out, all these sorts of things. Since then, here, I'll let somebody in here. There we go. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me? Yes, sorry. Yep. Since then, Simon has done a phenomenal job. He's been the director of the Richardson Institute at Lancaster, research fellow at the Foreign Policy Center, specialist advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee, advisor to government departments in the UK and the US, research funding of over £600,000 from Carnegie Foundation, EISA, Lancaster University, and others. Of publications, I was absolutely astounded when I was going through this and trawling the information. According to my calculations, 22 peer-reviewed articles in top journals, 6 co-authored and authored books at top-level publishers, 6 co-edited books, 5 edited and co-edited special issues of journals, 14 book chapters, 11 commissioned governmental reports, 18 research briefs, 36 opinion pieces in major media outlets, and 60 invited talks and keynotes. This has been in the space of just 8 years. 8 years seems, for younger people, seems like a long time, but for somebody who's been in the profession a long time, this amount of output is absolutely incredible and very impressive. His media work, for which he won a staff award in 2016, University Staff Award, from what I was able to count, 16 different TV media outlets. He's had 10 different radio outlets, 18 different major written news outlets. So Simon's had a phenomenal impact, not only in terms of overall publications and the quality of those publications, of which I cannot speak because it's not an area of my expertise, but literally just watching the amount and the effort that's put in and the time and the success has been marvelous. I would argue he's been an absolute driving force behind the redevelopment of the Richardson Institute, and my guesstimate is around 400 Richardson Institute interns have gone through his internship program that he set up, supervised numerous PhD students, and been a mentor, and most importantly, he's been a member of the acclaimed PPR band, sadly suffering from a prolonged period of artistic differences, but hopefully future comeback tours may be planned. Also, he made brief appearances for the PPR football team, though currently it's been relegated and injuries have limited his ability to take part. Given all of these remarkable achievements, it's no surprise to me at all that we are at least electronically gathering to celebrate his remarkable success, his remarkable output, and this inaugural lecture. So in a way, I just wanted to flag up the incredible efforts, the incredible outputs that Simon has put together to do this. So this is really, I would argue, yes, I'm very pleased that Mark has put together this or reignited or restarted this inaugural lecture. But I would also emphasize it is extremely well-deserved, and Simon, it's marvelous to see that you're the one restarting this, and extremely well-deserved. To finish off, I just wanted to make a couple of historical notes. I started at the beginning. I was thinking we're now currently going through a pandemic and Brexit. The Tokyo Olympics, unlike London, were canceled. Boris Johnson is currently PM. Trump is going out of the White House, which is not a bad thing. And we finish with Baby Shark having 8 billion views on the internet. So we went from a cat to a shark in the time. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about the linkages between Simon's remarkable output and the aforementioned historical events. But in any case, I want to congratulate Simon. I look forward to this, to the lecture. And I want to thank Simon for all of his efforts and all of his work, and very much look forward to the talk. So thank you. Please, Simon.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd say with you, but with you in spirit, if not in person. I'm not entirely sure of convention here, but I have a PowerPoint that has lots of pretty pictures. And as George Bush once said, books are great because sometimes they have pretty pictures. So I'm going to try and load up this and share with you some pretty pictures. I don't know if that's working or not. It says it's supposed to be.
Yep.
Yep. You can
I
see
can
it?
see it.
Did it change?
Now it's key questions.
Oh, amazing. It worked. Great. I still have some doubts about technology. Some things will never change. But thank you so much for everyone for coming along and for putting this on, Mark. Robert, thank you so much for your really kind remarks. There's a nice symmetry to what's gone on here, and I really appreciate it being you to introduce this lecture today, given that you were indeed the person that hired me all those years ago, which seems like a lifetime ago, to be honest, particularly in light of what's happened over the past 9 months, which goes back to the time when this book came out. This book is a pre-pandemic book, which seems very strange to say. It's a book that comes out of a number of years worth of work while at Lancaster. And I'm going to talk about some of the main themes of the book in this shortish lecture today. I'd like to thank everyone who helped me during the process of the book, colleagues, friends, PhD students, SEPAD fellows. A lot of people helped stimulate a lot of the ideas that went into this, and it's a book that was written across a number of different continents, from India to the US. But a great deal of time, of course, was spent in the Middle East writing the book and doing the research for the book. It draws on 6 years of field work on and off the region and from across different states within the region, seeking to understand the events of the Arab Uprisings. Some of the events, some of the ideas in the book stem from some rather uncomfortable experiences on a trip in the south of Beirut. And those of you who know the south of Beirut will know some of the tensions and issues that are at play there. And I was one time politely asked to step into a car with some rather large gentlemen who proceeded to take me to a venue with them, and we had a very nice, polite chat about what I was doing there and why I was there and who I was working for. Managing to convince them that I was just a lowly academic, I was let go, at which point I was then picked up by some other less than friendly looking gentlemen in a similar car. This one had police emblazoned over it, and I was taken to a police station and questioned, and we had some discussions about, again, what I was doing there. And what that experience showed was the parallel processes of governance and sovereign power that were in operation across Beirut. The first group that picked me up were representatives from a Lebanese group called Hezbollah, the Party of God, and the second were the Lebanese State Police. And these are two groups whose authority and legitimacy and ultimately sovereignty over particular parts of Beirut is in question. sometimes not quite in parallel, and it certainly challenges the Weberian notion of sovereign power where things are neatly aligned. I should say that there was a great deal of concern about what I was doing in that area. It was a time when Daesh had just emerged onto the scene, and within 3 months of that incident, there was a devastating bomb blast that killed, I think it was 34 people in Dahia in South Beirut. So that incident helped raise some serious questions in my mind that had been sort of bubbling away in the research that I'd been doing at the time over the ways in which sovereign power is operationalized, plays out, and regulates life across the state, with a particular focus on the Middle East, of course. And I'd been doing a bit of work on the Arab Uprisings, and I've been engaging in some questions about how we understand the events of the uprisings themselves, trying to understand how particular states collapsed, started to fragment, rulers were toppled, but then in others, rulers were easily able to circumvent the challenges posed by the widespread protest movements. And from the literature that I'd been engaging with, there was a lot of empirically driven material, but there wasn't much conceptual discussion over the broader processes at play, the challenges to sovereign power. And I thought that was perhaps a bit of an oversight. And so questions started to emerge with regard to the roots of sovereign power in the region, and how it was contested within the context of states. And as you start quickly going into these discussions, you start to realize that, well, there's a good degree of overlapping issues, of parabolic pressures that mean that as things play out in one state, they easily resonate across the region. So there's regional dimensions, regional repercussions of this contestation. And so what I was looking at is situated at the intersection of both international relations, international politics, political theory, and area studies. So what started out to be an investigation into the Arab Uprisings quickly turned into something a little bit more challenging, let's say. And it took me back to some of my my philosophy background as an undergraduate many moons ago. And so I started out by looking at ideas of sovereignty and the state. And I was fortunate in my time at Lancaster to have worked with some really wonderful PhD students, and to have some reading groups where we go through contemporary historical literature on particular topics. And one of the most interesting was when we read Ibn Khaldun's the Muqaddimah, who Ibn Khaldun was a wonderfully ambitious thinker from the Arab world, who argued in a wide-ranging treatise that politics is fundamentally about the survival of the species. And that was quite a provocative statement that really got me thinking about the ways in which politics, state power, governance all operate, all play out, all interact with one another. And it echoed with a lot of the debates in more contemporary literature on states. For example, the likes of Joel Migdal, Charles Tripp, Charles Tilly talk about the performativity of states. They talk about states not being immutable, but sites of performativity. And Joel Migdal, whose definition of a state I use in the book, suggests that a state is, and I quote here, an organization composed of numerous agencies led and coordinated by the state's leadership, brackets executive authority, that has the ability or authority to make and implement the binding rules for all of the people, as well as the parameters of rule, making for other social organizations in a given territory, using force if necessary to have its way. So I thought that was a really good way of understanding a state, and it had echoes of what Ibn Khaldun was talking about. And so I did quite a bit of work engaging in some of these more traditional definitions of statehood and enjoying the ideas of, or engaging with the ideas of how we conceptualize states, whether we can talk about states as universals, things like that. And a number of problems started to arise that I'll get onto in a minute. But one of the key challenges pertain to technical conflation of states and regimes and nations. And one of the things that I try and do in the book is to talk about some of the issues with regard to that. And I argue that I focus on regimes and their ability to exert sovereign power because that is perhaps an analytically distinct issue from a state or indeed from a government. You have a regime that has a degree more permanence, let's say, than a government. And regimes have a vested interest in their own survival, not just the survival of a particular government, but in some ways generational survival, let's say. And these are all the governance strategies that are imposed by governments and by regimes are designed to instill order, regulate life. But in doing that, there are competing visions put forward that are affected by a whole host of things pertaining to local context, the contingency of time and space, and indeed regional currents. So it started to strike me that there's actually a great deal more at play than first would appear. And this is where another of the reading groups that I held began to bear fruition, and that was reading some of the work of Giorgio Agamben, who's one of the more challenging thinkers that I've engaged with, but he's a thinker whose work I greatly admire. Someone who seeks to critically reflect on ideas around sovereign power and the regulation of life, focusing on that ability to regulate life rather than focusing on the quote unquote sovereign state. So Agamben has serious intellectual problems with the concept of sovereignty. He declares that it's neither external nor internal to the juridical order. And the problem of defining it concerns precisely a threshold or a zone of indifference where inside and outside do not exclude each other, but rather blur with each other. The suspension of the norm does not mean its abolition, and the zone of anomie that it establishes is not, or at least claims not to be, unrelated to the juridical order. And so what Agamben's dealing with here is what he terms the state of exception, which he terms as the preliminary condition for any definition of the relation that binds and at the same time abandons the living being to law. So what he's engaging with fundamentally is the way in which life is regulated, the ways in which power operates and includes people within the governance structures of the state, in some ways through inclusion and in other ways included through its exclusion. So it's a complex set of thoughts that it took Agamben a series of 9 books to really delve into. So the chances of me offering a detailed overview of his thought in the next 20 minutes are slim at best. But I'll just flag up some of the key thoughts and some of the key ideas that I think are useful for the book. What he's doing in this project is building on some of the work of the likes of Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin, Carl Schmitt, and Michel Foucault, building on ideas of biopolitics. He's trying to, quote unquote, complete Foucault's biopolitical project, which is concerned with the organization and control of human life, concerned with inclusion through exclusion. And he terms this a paradigm of government. And what he's fundamentally concerned with is the ways in which the law is able to regulate life and give rise to the regulation of life, encompassing living beings within that by means of its own suspension. And he argues that it does this through bringing bare life, what he terms bare life, at the forefront of politics. And this move is to bring the figure of Homo sacer to the forefront of politics. And this figure for Agamben is a figure that helps him to draw distinction between 2 different forms of life, predicated on the Aristotelian distinction between the realms of bios and zoe. So a binary distinction between those recognized as fully human through their participation in political life and those who are outside, where political life and meaning is stripped from them, creating a zone of indistinction and bare life in what he terms Homo sacer. Now that figure, Homo sacer, is an individual who can be killed with impunity, but who cannot be sacrificed. And that idea of being killed without any charges being levied against someone is really important for what follows in the book. He talks about the idea of the camp as a hidden paradigm of political space of modernity, a site of possibility, as well as a specific area in which life is stripped from meaning. And it's in these conditions where bare life becomes political through its inclusion, bound in a more fundamental political relationship with sovereign power. And there's a great deal in the book and in Agamben's work about how this actually works, how this plays out within the context of states. But conscious of time, I will move on, and I'll just briefly touch on ideas of order, because this is something that Agamben sets up. On ideas of nomos, which is something that Agamben explores, but it's something that I try and bring into the book as well, because I argue that what's missing from Agamben's conception of nomos is the more normative side of nomos. So nomos is a foundational ordering principle, essentially. There's some wonderful work being done on the concept of nomos, from dating back from the ancient Greeks to more contemporary work focusing on the likes of Schmidt and Agamben. But I argue in the book that, well, we need to bring in a more normative account of nomos, of world building and order. And here I build on the likes of Hannah Arendt, Peter Berger, Robert Cover, to talk about the ways in which normative values from religion, from culture, from heritage, have this ability to impose meaning on the world, to regulate life in a way that maybe circumvents or supplements, is perhaps a better word, supplements sovereign power. So there's an additional dimension to nomos that I think is incredibly important, and I try and explore the ways in which that plays out as well. But again, conscious of time, I'm going to swiftly move on. So in doing this, then, I begin the exploration by focusing on the post-World War I climate of state building, which was a process of inclusive exclusions, of delineating what is to be included within particular states and what is not to be included, about where the lines are to be drawn between states and other states. And there's obviously the idea of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the arbitrary borders. It's something that gained a lot of attention in more recent times with Daesh and the very symbolic image of Bastian Vasquez standing on the border between Iraq and Syria, declaring an end to Sykes-Picot. But I think it would have shocked him to know that the Sykes-Picot Agreement never actually came to fruition. But it was actually the treaties of Sèvres and a collection of diplomatic agreements from that time, of course, influenced by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But it's that colonial legacy, of course, that's really important. But the imposition of these states from above creates a particular set of conditions that ultimately generate parabolic pressures from above and below, where you have these states that are imposed with colonial actors that are interacting with strong tribal currents, strong ethnic currents, the residue of the Ottoman Empire, the burgeoning pan-Arab nationalist movement, later the pan-Islamist movement, and these nascent states are trying to engage with processes of state building, of institutional development, and to circumvent the challenges of these different types of parabolic pressures. And I think it's looking through some archival documents for this part of the book. There's a lot of really interesting and pretty devastating stuff in there about the legacy of the British, particularly with regard to the cultivation of sectarian difference. And what I argue in the book is that some of the roots of contemporary sectarian violence have their roots in the British actions of the 1920s, and there are some who've done wonderful work on this in Bahrain, the likes of Stacey Strobel, Mark Owen Jones, Omar al-Shahabi. But I was looking at some of the diaries of Gertrude Bell and some of her work, and she's got this real suspicion about the actions of the Shia of Iraq, and she starts using these narratives of pernicious interference and divided loyalties and Persian fifth columnists. At the time, of course, Iran was Persia, and these are narratives that you continue to hear to this day about the Shia of the region being Iranian fifth columnists, part of a quote-unquote Shia crescent. And it was really interesting and pretty frustrating, of course, to hear these framings, these suspicions starting to come out even at this time. And I think that tells you about the latent sectarianism and suspicion of the other that was starting to emerge even in the 1920s. And this, of course, then is institutionalized in state building, in the development of institutions, the way in which states and their bureaucracies were put together as these new rulers tried to institutionalize the bureaucracies needed to regulate life. In Iraq, for example, Shia were largely omitted and marginalized from the military, particularly the upper echelons of the military, and the same thing in Bahrain and elsewhere. And you had a serious schism forming between the rural and the urban dimensions as well. So there was a clear spatial dimension discrimination that was going on, with most of the Shia being found in the rural areas. Over time, the states had to deal with the pressures of pan-Arabism and pan-Islamism, seeking to balance against these threats that permeated across their borders and sought to draw support from the citizens and the inhabitants of particular states. And pan-Arabism, of course, became deeply popular, and later various pan-Islamist movements also sought to challenge the state system in competing visions of order, competing nomoi, if you will. And states tried to balance against that, tried to impose a degree of order on that by using the tools of their sovereign power. And of course, all of this generates latent frustrations, grievances that eventually come out over time. And we see this in a range of different instances of anger and frustration, some of which happened within the context of the War on Terror, but many of them took place in the years that followed. I spent quite a bit of time in the book looking at the way in which this all plays out in political documents, in constitutions, the way in which states seek to draw upon turath, the idea of heritage and culture, how they try and deploy local tradition, identity and ideology within governance structures to draw on local instances of legitimacy in support of their own rule. And a good example of this is in Saudi Arabia, where the Al Saud sought to position themselves as a tribal ruler for a tribal state, sort of the sheikh of the sheikhs, if you will. So drawing on this culture and this heritage and tradition to support their claims to sovereign power. And that's not just a case of Saudi Arabia, but many cases as well. And constitutions give rise to, of course, an examination of some of the ideas that Agamben puts forward, particularly with regard to the operation of sovereign power, the institutional discrimination, the ability to draw on emergency laws, the ability to suspend the law in pursuit of regime interests, and the right to do whatever a particular regime deems necessary to ensure their survival. And for example, Egypt, after Hosni Mubarak came to power, endured a number of decades of life under these emergency laws through derogation, through various different legal clauses that allowed the state to regulate life, allowed the Mubarak regime to regulate life, not in accordance with the rule of law, but in accordance with a perennial state of exception, whereby the state of exception became, as Walter Benjamin said, the new norm. And later, this ability to manipulate and abuse sovereign power resulted in widespread citizenship revocation as a mechanism through which life could be regulated. I'll just very quickly, before I move on, say this title, Ink on Paper, came from an interview with a Yemeni who observed that when talking about constitutions, that they are just ink on paper, that they don't mean anything. And when you look at what's going on in Yemen now and Yemeni history, you see that at present it's spread across 333 regions within the state, which is approximately the size of Texas. But yet there is no centralized state able to exert control. There's long-standing history of violence, civil war, fragmentation. And it's easy to see that in some cases you have this extreme sovereign power. In cases you have constitutions that are designed to regulate life and protect people. But in many cases, the reality is that this is just ink on paper. One of the other points of tension in the book pertains to this tension between the Dawla and the Ummah. So the state and the Ummah being the collective of Muslims. Fred Halliday, in a really interesting article, sets out over 10 different ways in which the Ummah can be defined, which tells you quite a lot about the competing visions of nomos and order that can be relating to this idea of Ummah. But I think this is really important with regard to an exploration of sovereign power, because for Muslims, God is the source of sovereign power. But this leads to a source of tension when you try and institutionalize that in government or governance. And so the relationship of Islam in state building is actually quite incongruent. It leads to some serious problems with regard to how you conceptualize this in a constitution. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, sovereignty is couched in both God and the king, which can cause some technical problems with regard to the source of sovereign power. And you then have as well a degree of tension that starts to arise between where the source of sovereign power and sovereign order or nomos is grounded, whether it's in a state, the dawla, whether you obey the laws of the state, or whether you obey the laws of your faith. Now, a lot of the book is focusing on the Arab and Muslim world, but there's some important stuff that comes out here with regard to the state of Israel. And I'll just use a quick example in terms of recent developments pertaining to some of the more right-wing soldiers who are going to do their military service. And there have been a number of controversies in recent years with regard to the ability of military leaders to ensure that their soldiers obey the military commanders and not the rabbis. There's a tension between whether the state and the institutions of the state can continue to exert power and control over their military, or whether the rabbis, who may well have a different vision of order and what the state of Israel should be, or in some cases, what it should not be. And if you have a strong believer, then there have been a number of instances whereby there have been tensions. People have been dishonorably discharged from the military, and I think that gives you a good example of the ways in which you have tensions over state and religion. There's a discussion of the impact of 1979 with regard to the Iranian Revolution, but also the seizure of the Grand Mosque of Mecca, which I think is a really significant development for Saudi Arabia and broader discussions of Islamism across the world, because what it does is it sort of turbocharges the Al Saud's proselytizing vision, given that the seizure of the Grand Mosque of Mecca by Juhayman al-Utaybi and a bunch of his followers was done because they declared that the Al Saud were not Islamic enough, that the protectors of the two holy places of Mecca and Medina were not behaving in a pious enough manner, and they called on their followers to seize the Grand Mosque and to try and overthrow the Al Saud, and that prompted the Al Saud to use some of their oil reserves and the wealth from oil reserves to proselytize the Wahhabi vision, turbocharging, if you will, a broader competition over the nature of Islam that had been already exacerbated by the Iranian Revolution just across the Gulf. So you have all these tensions starting to play out with regard to the state and the Ummah, the broader collective, and membership of these different collectives that starts to pull at the seams of the state. And it's not just related to sort of theological questions. This has practical implications. Excuse me. As Akile Mbembe says, space is the raw material of sovereignty. It's the arena for political life. And in the book, I try and draw on some political geographers and some geographers more broadly, such as Doreen Massey, to explore the ways in which sovereign power plays out across space. And I think there are some really, really devastating examples. On the left of the screen, there's a photo of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which is one of the holiest sites in Judaism. It's also at the top of that one of the holiest sites in Islam, or the third holiest site in Islam. And on the capture of East Jerusalem from the Jordanian army in 1967, some key Israeli Defense Force planners decided that they needed to get much greater ease of access to the Western Wall. And so they destroyed a long-standing compound quarter, they would call it in the old city of Jerusalem, the Moroccan quarter, by way of trying to transform and ultimately Judaize that space. And now if you go to Jerusalem, you'll see the ways in which that whole space has been sort of venerated, has been positioned at the center. All pathways leading up to it have been restored, heavily securitized, of course, but it's a dramatic transformation to try and facilitate a broader existential transformation of Jerusalem and also the state of Israel, which also included the transformation and the gentrification of other parts of Jerusalem and Jaffa and parts of Tel Aviv as well. Similarly, in Beirut, there were broader gentrification processes that took place that others are far more equipped to talk about than I, some of them in this lecture, I believe. But I think the point of Beirut, Jaffa and Jerusalem, and indeed the destruction of various Palestinian refugee camps, Jenin in particular, demonstrates the capacity of sovereign power to try and regulate space through processes of herbicide, symbolic, structural violence, but also in less obvious ways. And in the middle of the screen is a photograph taken by me in Manama in Bahrain. And this is one of the main highways through Manama, from Al Muharraq, and what you see is this intersection, and right at the heart of the intersection is a photo of King Hamad, the King of Bahrain, and to the left of the photo you see another much bigger photograph of King Hamad. Underneath that you can just about make out a couple of people. Those people were members of the security services, and what you can't see are some rather large weapons. But if you were to drive up and down that road, you will see numerous images of King Hamad. If you go into a hotel or a cafe, you'll see King Hamad, you'll see Crown Prince Salman. You will be very, very clear that you are in an Al Khalifa state. And it's, I argue in the book, a form of structural violence. Now, this all came to a head, of course, in 2011, when people took to the streets. We're approaching the 10th anniversary of the self-immolation of a Tunisian street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, which is a week today, actually, who self-immolated out of widespread socioeconomic frustrations, a lack of hope, essentially, a real sense of frustration, and an anger of a lack of opportunities. He self-immolated, and this prompted a spate of protests that spread across the region from Tunisia all the way down to the south of the Arabian Peninsula, with the chant of Al-Shab yurid isqat al-Nizam. The people want the fall of the regime. And this took many people by surprise. But if we look at what happened across the region in the years prior to that, you see that there are myriad examples of people expressing anger and frustration and deep-seated grievances at the ways in which their lives had been regulated, and their scope for political engagement. There's a wonderful quote by an Egyptian scholar who observing the Mubarak regime, described it as decades of, and I quote here, regime success and state failure. And I think that's a really good way of showing how the rich got rich and the rest of the state, the people of the state, were the ones who paid the ultimate price, who were pushed to the side, marginalized, held in these conditions of struggling to really thrive, struggling for a lack of hope, struggling for a lack of opportunities. There were widespread socioeconomic frustrations, 247.5 billion pounds of capital flight from the Middle East in the decade leading up to the Arab Uprisings. And in the 50 years leading up to the uprisings themselves, around $1 trillion was lost in corruption. So there are, of course, many examples of protest dating back to the formation of the states, but they culminated in this spate of protests in the early months of 2011. But the state wouldn't give up. The protests posed a serious challenge to their own survival. They posed a challenge to the organization of life across the region. And there were a number of different responses that were proposed. Some were more reform-minded. Some drew on token reforms to try and placate the protesters. In Amman, a number of officials were fired from their posts, and in return, Sultan Qaboos, who was a deeply popular ruler, received an apology from the protesters. In other states, such as other Gulf monarchies, handouts were given. In Saudi Arabia, $130 billion was put towards addressing the challenge of the protesters, which was, I believe, bigger than the 2007 budget. In the UAE, $2 billion was given in housing loans. In Qatar, $8 billion was given in salary and benefits payments. So in those oil-rich states, finance was used. Elsewhere, there was a dramatic security crackdown as the state used the various mechanisms of control. It used its sovereign power as a means of ensuring its survival. And one of the examples I'll give you here is the case of Eman Salehi, who's the woman on the left of your screen, who was a Bahraini sports journalist. She was not covering the protests. She was Shia. And in the early months, I believe, of 2012, sorry, in December 2012, she was shot dead by a member of the Al Khalifa, by a member of the ruling family. And this individual handed himself in at a police station, where he then walked free. So that, I would argue, is a really good example of the ways in which the state had created conditions of bare life, where people could be killed with impunity, where they could be killed, and there would be no recourse to the legal mechanisms of the state. So all these different machineries of control were deployed. In Bahrain, the key symbolic site of the protest, Pearl Roundabout, was quickly destroyed, ultimately decimating the protest movement very, very quickly by securitizing the protests and by embarking on a process of sectarianization. Similarly, in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, who many thought would engage in a process of token reform, quickly framed the protesters as jihadists, as Sunni extremists. And many of them were, because he had released them from his prisons. But in doing that, he justified his actions as part of a quote-unquote war on terror. And elsewhere, state power was used to crush the hopes and the dreams of the protesters. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohammed Morsi, which came to power in the months after the uprisings, was toppled by a military coup in July of 2013, 14, I believe. Sorry, dates are escaping me right now. But what we're seeing with all of this is the deployment of all these different technologies of power, the different tools of sovereign power and control that the state was able to use. And of course, I should say military courts became tools used to try the protesters, but there was very little by way of international condemnation. At first, the United States, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, David Cameron had been vocal in support of the protesters. But very quickly, this support turned to very, very quiet framing of the protesters, and ultimately turned to supporting the regime. So there was a gradual shift. And you started to see leaders like Obama not speaking about protests in the likes of Bahrain, which of course is home to the US Fifth Fleet. So there was a shift in the narrative about how this was covered, which I think reflects the broader geopolitical importance of certain regional allies and their levels of international support. And I think this leaves the region in a delicate position. It leaves the region struggling with people struggling to really assert their agency in the face of a struggle for the state. That parabolic set of relationships between rulers and ruled continues, albeit conditioned by the contingencies of time and space, where context is really key. The Palestinian cause is one of the clearest and the harsh victims of all of this, particularly with the geopolitical dimensions of what's been going on, as you see this realignment of regional politics against Iran rather than against Israel, and it's the Palestinian cause that seems to be paying the heaviest price. And there are now, I think, a number of serious questions to be asked, and the book concludes by asking, or posing, I should say, some of these questions about the continued role of the United States, about the capacity for individuals to facilitate change. The book was written and completed, and with the printers, at a time when the events of 2019 in Iraq and Lebanon took place, with the protests against the sectarian elites. And I think that would have led to a slightly different conclusion. It's a very, very downbeat conclusion, because the conclusion is the people of the region have paid the heaviest of prices. But had the book been a few months later, there might have been a slightly more upbeat tone, given that people were still trying to find ways of challenging the state, trying to deactivate certain mechanisms through which state power operates. But had it been a few months later than that, then it might have actually been the initial slightly downbeat conclusion, because ultimately I think sovereign power is so strong in some of these states that it's very difficult to see very much else happening other than the regimes continuing to survive. And I think that's where slightly over time, but sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's very nice to have an event where colleagues come together, and it's not talking about running the department in this difficult time. So, very interesting lecture. Now we've got 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So have we got any questions from the floor? Okay, I'll get the ball rolling. So Simon, where are you going to develop this project further? Is it kind of leading to a sort of new project?
So I guess there's two things at play. Can I just check, Mark? I've stopped sharing my screen. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Excellent. So there's a couple of dimensions. One is an exploration of the ways in which regional politics plays out at a local level, and that's looking at the interaction of the rivalry between the Saudis and the Iranians on local politics in Lebanon, Bahrain, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and that's trying to challenge some of the narratives about sectarianism being the sort of the driving force of regional politics, and suggesting that, well, actually, it's not just about this rivalry between the Saudis and the Iranians. It's actually about the interaction of nationalist politics, socioeconomic context, space, ethnicity, tribalism, a whole host of different factors. So that's one part. And then a second is to try and push some of the Agamben ideas a bit further, to look at the ways in which Agamben's ideas help us to understand more the actual regulation of protest movements, but also the contestation of that sovereign power, with possibly someone in this room who's still here. So yeah, there's a number of different avenues to go down, and we're continuing to push some of the ideas of Sepad as well. So I think there's a lot to explore.
Okay, great. Okay, any questions? Don't be shy.
Soon,
Robert.
real.
Yeah, Robert.
Sorry, I don't want to block anybody, so please, I'm happy to have somebody else go. I guess in a way, what was been coming in my mind in a larger question, and it all sort of wraps around this in my own mind. You have the U.S. in a sense pulling, or at least presuming to pull out or back off from its interventions, its continual intense interventions in the Middle East. And that combining with a shift in the economy away from carbon-based productions on a global scale and transition, in a way, there's something in my mind of saying, will you start to see a more significant shift towards, in a sense, rather than these various states having to deal with this monstrous external influence, in the sense of a bubbling up of internal settlements occurring as they, in a sense, have to deal with these internal processes instead of, in a sense, having all this direct internal and external intervention?
Well, I think that's an interesting question in the sense that in many ways that external intervention is desired. And for many across the region, the American presence is much needed and much desired. And I'll give you an example that one of the main reasons for the rivalry between the Saudis and the Iranians being so vitriolic pertains to the role of the United States. And that for Saudi Arabia, for the United Arab Emirates, for the Israelis, and for others who are more aligned with that bloc, let's say, the United States serves as a security guarantor. They are smaller states in terms of demographics. They're much stronger militarily and economically. But I think the demographic imbalance is a cause for concern with regard to Iran. And I would be of the view that when the Obama administration tried to get the Iranians and the Saudis to share the region, quote unquote, share the region, to make good, be friends, play nice, the Saudis were pretty frustrated. There was some pretty strong language being used towards Washington about being abandoned, about Obama not really understanding the nature of the relationship or the nature of regional politics. And I think what we could well see, if that is the case, if Washington continues this withdrawal for whatever manner of reasons, I wouldn't be all that surprised to see some other form of addressing the security needs of those states. But I can't see it purely being reliant on each other. I can't see a purely internal way of addressing their security needs, which is what the Iranians want. The Iranians want an internal mechanism to address security. They don't want to be reliant on, or they don't want to have the presence of an external actor.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay, we got a question from Sharuk.
Hi, Simon and everyone. Thank you very much, Simon. A wonderful lecture, very substantive in terms of analysis of the region and the comparisons. I really enjoyed that. I just have a question about the conclusion. I wasn't clear whether you were saying that the shape that sovereign power has taken in the region is actually crushing resistance or political activism. My thought was, as you were talking more toward the idea that there isn't actually sovereign authority, that state building or nation states have failed to build sovereign authority in many Arab countries. It's the usage of crude power that is the proof. It compensates for the lack of this kind of sovereignty. So in the context of Egypt, for example, the state for a majority of Egyptians has no legitimacy. Even pro-coup Egyptians in 2013 have largely switched camps today, not in support of the Muslim Brotherhood, but in realization that the coup did happen and is problematic, and that the state has no legitimacy, and that the sovereignty is now more like the crude power of the army. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that and maybe clarify the conclusion a little bit more.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Sharuk. So what I tried to do earlier on by focusing on the work of Agamben, I move away from the idea of the quote unquote nation state or the sovereign state to focus on sovereign power. And in doing that, I make the distinction between the state and regimes. And it's the regime is the one that is able to wield all these different technologies of power in pursuit of their own interests. And I would argue that regimes have done a good job, not normatively good, but good in the way of reflecting on their own processes and improving their own ability to crush opposition and dissent. And in doing that, they've been able to largely address instances of opposition and dissent, and certainly in Egypt. And if I read you the last line of the book, as contestation escapes territorial borders, the fight for survival occurs within a broader struggle for regional supremacy where people are sacrificed in the name of political projects and ultimately regime survival. So it's not about the state per se, it's about the regime, it's about these elites that have captured the sovereign power of the state. And that's what I'm really getting at, the way in which these regimes have captured that power and exert power.
Yeah, I'm totally in agreement with you, but I think maybe more on an optimistic note, and here more as someone who was interested personally in the uprisings rather than an academic. The idea of a thawra mustamirra, the revolution continues, despite all the technologies of power. The fact that dissent and resistance and opposition continue in various of these contexts, despite these technologies of power, means that they haven't really succeeded in the way they might, they might like to portray themselves. So I personally feel more optimistic because the dissent and the opposition, even under these terrible conditions, is still finding ways of being articulated. And if you're following I'm following Egypt, of course, as an Egyptian. There has been so many instances since the summer of activists and people you don't expect to be activists trying to mobilize, including actors. I don't know if you followed that.
Yeah.
Including actors who broke away from client relationships with the army, who has managed to, that particular person has managed to mobilize thousands of people online against the regime, and after all the crushing that happened to the opposition in the last 7 years. So actually, I'm still full of hope, but anyway.
Well, I'm pleased to hear, because I've been struggling with hope for a while, having been focusing more on Lebanon and Iraq and Bahrain. But I think that hope that you talk about is so important, and I think it's the dream lives on, right? The dreams of 2011, the hopes and the dreams are still there amongst many, even amongst Bahraini friends and colleagues that I'm doing a lot of work with. And they're still there, despite having 800 people having their citizenship revoked since 2011. There are still people working in creative ways to find ways of circumventing this sovereign power. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that needs more work doing. I think someone in this chat, John Nagel, has done a lot of really interesting work on the ways in which LGBTQ movements in Lebanon have tried to circumvent the sovereign power, or the various sovereign powers across Lebanon, by deactivating what Agamben calls destituent power, deactivating some of the structures that are designed to regulate and control life. And I think that's one of the really interesting ways that we can push some of these discussions forward, looking at those ideas of destituent power as mechanisms through which human agency can operate and thrive, and state power, sovereign power, can be deactivated, if you will.
Thank you.
Okay, I saw a question from, I can just see the initial B. Yep. I'm sorry, I can't see your name. I can just see B on my screen, the icon. Well, anyone else to ask a question? There's someone with their hand up. Oh, Balsam. Yep. Balsam, do you want to ask a question? No. Anyone else? Got 5 minutes.
Hi.
Oh,
yeah.
hi.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, it was muted, sorry. Thank you very much, Simon. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Balsam.
I was talking, I thought that, yeah, I was heard. Okay, thank you very much, Simon, for a fascinating lecture. I have learned a lot. I have a question actually building on what Shourouk has just said, and it's really interesting because she was talking about the context of Egypt, and I was thinking something similar about Iraq, because when you mention sovereignty, power, and also a regime, I think those concepts are contested in a way in those different contexts, because especially in Iraq, so some people would use government, state, but other will say that actually there is no government. We cannot even talk about regime, basically, because we have like multiple actors, militias, armed groups, and each one has some power. And this also reflects upon the issue of resistance by different groups, because they are also fragmented. I also have hope, but the problem is really more complicated when you are dealing with multiple actors on the ground, with multiple powers. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about this concepts. Can we talk about like different conceptualizations of those terms according to the different contexts in question?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. I mean, I think what you're getting at there pertains to sovereign power and fragmented sovereignty and contested sovereignty in particular cases, because the ways in which sovereign power would work and where sovereignty lies in the Iraqi case, I think is dramatically different to Egypt or Bahrain or Saudi, because you've got I guess a fragmented state, or you've got a state in which a number of different actors would lay claim to sovereign power. Yeah, you have elites that would lay claim, excuse me, to that sovereignty and would declare that they are legitimately sovereign. But then the reality, of course, is perhaps somewhat different. And what I do in the book is try and explore some of those questions in a slightly different way by looking at ideas of nested sovereignty, the idea that you may have this particular entity that operates and lays claim to sovereignty, but then the reality is that in these particular spaces there are entities that themselves have the ability to lay claim to being sovereign over that particular entity. But that concept operates sort of in the form of a Russian, if you will, that you have these mini sovereigns, these nested sovereigns within a broader quote unquote sovereign. And I think what you get in the case of Iraq or maybe in Lebanon as well is the fragmentation of that broader sovereign, and then these other instances of nested sovereigns. And one of the things that I got out of the book when I was working through it is that not only do you have these nested sovereigns, but you also have nested nomoi, that you have these localized orders that don't necessarily play out across states, of course, and there may be levels of incongruence with different nomoi and relating to sovereign power, of course. So you get these zones of indistinction that Agamben flags up across all of his work. And I think that's where you get some of these issues really coming to the fore, when you have the fragmented, I guess, shell of a state, but then within that shell, with no one really being able to lay claim to the sovereign power overall, you have these nested sovereigns with nested nomoi, which don't neatly coalesce. You have all these different messy sets of interactions. And I think that's what we're seeing in Iraq. It's what we see in Lebanon. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, Simon, we've got one more question from John Nagel.
Yeah, hi, Simon. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. Just a really kind of follow-up question. I'm not sure entirely how coherent I'm going to be at 6 o'clock on the Thursday night. But obviously, we've seen across the Middle East over the last kind of 10 years the retrenchment of a state, and this has left all of these gaps where all of these kind of different sort of non-state actors have kind of filled the gap. And I suppose my question is, in terms of, contesting sovereign power, if sovereign power is held by all of these different sort of non-state actors, how is it possible for social movement, protest actors to really affect any sort of change? Because obviously they can't operate through the mechanism of the state itself, because the state doesn't really exist anymore. So it's, just wondering if you could kind of speak to this possibility of actually affecting change in the context of a place where the state doesn't really exist anymore.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess it depends on what you mean by change. I think it's easy to facilitate change at a local level. And I was actually having these discussions about Yemen last week, about governance in Yemen and how to facilitate levels of peace building and governance in Yemen when you have exactly what you've just been talking about. And rather than having that sort of decentralization from the state, from the core, and having sort of a nested sovereignty from the center and then going down to more localized nested instances of sovereign power, what was suggested is in the discussion was that you do the opposite. You build up from the ground. You have a localized initiative that is realistic in scope, but then builds up confidence, builds up trust, starts to gain traction, becomes more successful. Of course, that brings with it all manner of different challenges. But if done in the right way, you're able to facilitate more and more change, grounded in local context, and then to build up the shell of something on the basis of what's done at that local level. Now, it's easy to sit here and say, this is how it can be done, this is a possible solution. The reality, of course, is much harder, particularly when you've got not only the shell of a state, but also maybe key groups and stakeholders that aren't even in the state anymore. And I'm thinking of the growing numbers of diasporic civil society organizations who are spread across the world.
Okay. We've got time for one more question. Any takers? No. Well, I think we'll finish there, Simon. And I mean, what I think is great about this session is it feels like we're at this turning point where we're going to be talking less and less about managing the department in this difficult time, and hopefully getting back to more and more kind of events like this where we're kind of collaborating and coming together as academics and researchers and not just teachers managing this kind of strange situation. And so it's a nice way to end the term, because this is the last Thursday of the teaching term and tomorrow is the last day. So it's a really nice way to end the term. And I think if we were on campus, we would obviously be opening the champagne or Prosecco right now. And so hopefully, Simon, you can enjoy with your family, this great achievement. And so clap for you, and thank you all for coming tonight. So we'll see you soon, Simon. Have a good Christmas.
Mark. Thanks,
right, see you, Simon.
And thank you everyone for coming. It means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Have a good night.
Hey. Simon, do you still have a minute? We'll wait till
yeah.
Or is there somebody else? I mean, we'll wait and see if everybody's signing out.
Give me 1 second, Robert. I'll be back.
Yeah. No, you take your time. The other thing you might want to do is stop recording. I see you're recording. Have you? It's up in the